The world has almost seen World War III quite a few times, sometimes because of bad software, sometimes because of the weather, sometimes because someone didn't pick up the phone. The 1983 Soviet false alarm, the Able Archer scare, the Norwegian rocket incident. You've probably never heard of these stories, but next time, we might not be so lucky. September 26, 1983. A regular night shift inside Serpukhov 15, a secret Soviet bunker just south of Moscow. Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov sat in front of consoles that monitored the sky for nuclear threats. His job was straightforward but critical. If the system showed incoming missiles from the United States, his job was to report it up the chain. Once that call was made, the Soviet response would be automatic, no second chances. Shortly after midnight, the system lit up. One missile, then two, then three. A total of 5 missiles, all supposedly launched from the US bases. According to protocol, this meant only one thing: the Americans had initiated a nuclear strike. Petrov froze for a second, then forced himself to look again. Something felt off. If the US really wanted to start a nuclear war, why send only 5 missiles? That did not make any sense. A full-scale attack would mean hundreds, if not thousands. 5 looked wrong. Too small, too isolated. Petrov stalled. If he reported a confirmed attack, the Soviet leadership would have just minutes to decide. They'd likely launch a counterstrike without waiting for radar confirmation. The window for verifying ground radar signatures was razor thin. He picked up the phone, not to confirm the launch, but to say that it was false alarm. If he was wrong and those missiles were real, then he had just condemned his country to total annihilation. But he chose to go with his gut. The satellites had made mistakes before, so he couldn't just trust the software. Petrov waited. Minutes passed. Nothing hit. The call he never made was the only reason the world hadn't spiraled into World War III. Later, engineers confirmed it. The system had malfunctioned. A rare alignment of sunlight, high-altitude clouds, and the satellite's angle had created a false signal. The software flagged it as an American ICBM launch, which it was not. Petrov should have been a hero, but in the USSR, following instinct over protocol was not rewarded. His report embarrassed the military brass. They buried the story. Petrov got a slap on the wrist for not filling out his logbook properly. Then he was sidelined, quietly pushed out of the military into early retirement. For years, no one outside the Soviet command circles knew his name. The world only found out in the late 90s, after Soviet archives began to open up. Suddenly, Petrov's decision became a global headline. A single man had stopped a nuclear war with nothing but cold logic and a refusal to blindly trust machines. Just weeks after Petrov's near miss, another event brought the world perilously close to nuclear conflict. November 1983. NATO launches Able Archer 83, its annual war game designed to practice nuclear escalation procedures. But this time, something was different. The exercise introduced a new radio protocols that the Soviet interceptors had never heard of before. High-ranking officials participated, including potential involvement from US President Ronald Reagan himself. NATO simulated moving to DEFCON 1, the highest state of nuclear alert. The Soviet leadership was already paranoid. Pershing 2 missiles had been deployed across Europe, cutting Soviet response time to mere minutes. Intelligence reports suggested Reagan was planning a first strike. Operation Ryan, a massive Soviet intelligence program, had been scanning the West for signs of nuclear attack preparation. Able Archer 83 matched every indicator their agents were trained to identify. The Soviet response was immediate and terrifying. Nuclear bombs in East Germany and Poland were loaded with live warheads and placed on high alert. Missile units prepared for launch. The Fourth Air Army prepared preemptive strike that would have killed millions before NATO could complete what Moscow believed was an actual attack. Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz was monitoring Soviet military activity from his position with US air forces in Europe. The Soviet reaction was too intense, too genuine for a simple training exercise. Their bombers were actually armed. Perutz refused to escalate NATO's alert status despite the obvious Soviet military buildup. Any increase in Western readiness would have confirmed Soviet fears that Able Archer was actually a cover for real attack preparations. However, the exercise ended on November 11th, and as soon as it ended, Soviet forces slowly stood down. Neither side understood how close they had come to Armageddon. The Cold War may have officially ended, but the danger did not. On January 25, 1995, a team of American and Norwegian scientists launched the Black Brant 12 rocket from the Andøya rocket range in Norway. Its mission was simple: collect data on the northern lights over Svalbard. The launch was publicly announced. Notices were sent out to more than 30 countries, including Russia, but the Russian military never got the message. Somewhere in their chain of command, the warning got lost. Russian radar operators at the Olenogorsk Early Warning Station in the Arctic picked up the rocket moments after the launch. Everything about it mimicked a US Trident missile, specifically the early flight path of a submarine-launched ballistic missile, the kind that could carry an EMP warhead meant to blind Russian radars in advance of a full-scale strike. Inside the Kremlin, President Boris Yeltsin was handed the nuclear briefcase. Known as the Cheget, it contained the command and control tools for a retaliatory launch. It was the first time a Russian leader had ever activated it in response to a real-time threat. The countdown had started. What happened next came down to mere minutes. Analysts inside Russia's general staff rechecked the radar feed. The object was still moving fast, but it wasn't breaking up into warheads. It also wasn't descending toward any Russian targets. Its behavior didn't match that of an actual ICBM or a Trident-style launch. Just before the clock ran out, the rocket passed its peak and dropped into the sea near Spitsbergen. Different continent, different history, but the same risk. South Asia, two nations, both nuclear powers. It began in the mountains, not with a declaration or a missile launch, but with footsteps in snow. In May, Indian patrols in the Kargil region of Kashmir discovered something unusual. Enemy soldiers dug into fortified positions on the Indian side of the line of control. At first, it was written off as irregulars, maybe militants. But the scale, the coordination, the weapons, they all pointed toward Pakistani troops, operating above 16,000 feet, in territory they weren't supposed to be in. Over 130 infiltration points had been set up across a nearly 200-kilometer front. Pakistani fronts had occupied high-altitude ridges that overlooked National Highway 1A, the key supply line between Srinagar and Leh. By doing so, they had the ability to choke off logistics to the entire Indian military presence in Ladakh. Pakistan denied involvement, claimed that the men were Kashmiri insurgents, but India launched Operation Vijay, a full-scale military campaign to take the heights back. Thousands of troops were moved in, and the Indian Air Force launched Operation Safed Sagar to provide aerial support. It was the first time India had used air power in the region since 1971. The war was brutal. Artillery duels, close-quarter combat in ice-covered trenches, airstrikes on mountain-top bunkers. Then came the escalation. On May 31, during a press conference, Pakistan's Foreign Secretary issued a warning. If things got worse, he said, Pakistan would use any weapon in its arsenal to defend itself. The Indian military campaign, however, pressed on, slowly regaining the positions Pakistan had taken. But the nuclear shadow grew heavier with each battle won. By July, the United States, worried that the standoff might spiral, brought Pakistan's Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to Washington. In a closed-door meeting, President Clinton laid it out plainly. Pakistan's forces had to withdraw. If they didn't, Pakistan would face international condemnation, economic sanctions, and diplomatic isolation. Worse, they'd bear full responsibility for any further escalation, including nuclear consequences. Sharif pushed back. He claimed Pakistan had a moral obligation to support the Kashmiri cause, but Clinton did not budge. The Kargil War officially ended on July 26, 1999, when India regained control of the territory. The nuclear weapons were never launched, but they were never off the table either.